Hello, Hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Hunters, one of the most elusive questions asked by mankind is, what exactly was there in the beginning? Before humans, before the Earth, before the universe and the Big Bang, what, if anything, existed? You'd think that a show like Supernatural would have an easy answer, right? Especially after establishing the existence of a creator god who supposedly made everything. Thing is, the show gives us multiple stories about pre-creation, several of which contain contradictory content. Initially, it seems as if God, who is a version of the Abrahamic God, created everything besides himself, and he's just always been around. Later, the embodiment of death, known simply as Death, claims that he's as old, if not older than God, though he doesn't give any details about where either of them came from. Finally, we're eventually told that God has a twin known as the Darkness, and that originally, the two were unified as one singular being who had always existed and eventually split into the twins. I've already made 2 separate videos laying out my theories about the origins of God, darkness, and death. However, there is one more perspective that I need to cover in order to truly have the full story. In Season 13, we're introduced to the Shadow, a self-described cosmic entity who rolls over a blank void known as the Empty. Ever since this thing appeared in the show, the Shadow has occupied this weird place within the mythology of Supernatural. It seems to be pretty freaking powerful, yet we're never really given much information about its origins or nature. Now, that's actually pretty common for Supernatural. However, what makes this specific entity and its realm particularly interesting is a single bit of information offered up in its debut appearance. While talking to Cass, the Shadow claims that the Empty predates the God Twins, that at one point they didn't exist and there was only nothingness. Naturally, this seems to directly contradict Amara's claim about a lone, eternal being that's been around forever, and frustratingly, we never really get solid confirmation as to which story is true. Regardless of who's right, we're still left without an explanation for where the Shadow came from, or what it even is. In this video, I intend to lay out the certified facts that we have about this entity and its realm, and from there, we'll get into some theories that could make sense of their place within the cosmos of Supernatural. Also, I'm sorry if the visuals for this video get kind of repetitive. It seems like this one's going to be pretty long, and there's just not that much footage of the Shadow. It's not in the show very much. So, what do we actually know about the Shadow? Well, not much. I say this a lot on this channel, but genuinely, the Shadow is one of the most mysterious things in all of Supernatural. What we do know is that it's a self-described cosmic entity, which, if true, would imply that it's around the same class of being as the likes of Death, the Darkness, and God himself. Maybe. Technically, no other being really confirms that this thing is a cosmic or primordial or whatever, but there are a few similarities. For example, it does seem to be equipped with some pretty incredible power, being able to barge into heaven, overpower angels with ease, and even resurrect Castiel from the dead, something that, up to that point, only God had ever been able to do. So it does seem like the Shadow was telling the truth, though there is quite a bit of lore which makes it clear that it isn't directly related to God or his sister. Instead, this thing is fundamentally tied to a mysterious place known as the Empty. Now, the Empty itself is a whole bucket of questions, and I'll talk more about that later, but for now, I'll just say that the Empty seems to be a void of nothingness where the spiritual remains of angels and demons go after death. Not only is the Shadow the Empty's only native inhabitant, it's also the undisputed ruler of the realm, as it wields an incredible amount of power and influence over the Void and those who dwell there. In fact, it once claimed to be the only being in all of existence to have any sway over the Void, going as far as to state that even the likes of God and Death had no power over its turf. We'll talk more about the accuracy of that statement later, but the point stands that the Shadow seems to be one of the most powerful creatures in Supernatural, its strength dwarfed only by the likes of the God Twins. Like many of the metaphysical monsters in the show, we never see the Shadow's true form. Most of the time, it uses its shape-shifting abilities to take the form of a familiar face. Though unlike some other shifters, this one actually has a sort of default form it can take, that being a featureless humanoid made out of one of Supernatural's favorite effects, black goo. Yes, when it's not wearing a mortal disguise, the Shadow will sometimes appear as a person, pile, or tidal wave of jet black slime. Now, you might be tempted to think, oh Jack, you sexy fool, this ooze is clearly the creature's true form. Unfortunately, it really doesn't seem like that's the case. When the Shadow first appeared in the show, it tells Castiel that seeing its true form would drive him completely insane. And just in case you didn't catch that little detail, I'll repeat. He told this to Castiel, an angel, the kind of being that can usually stare down incomprehensible cosmic bullshit, no problem. If we're to believe the shadow, then even angelic minds will melt at the mere sight of its real face. And later, we saw that the Nephilim Jack looked upon the grey goo with no issue. So I'm inclined to believe that this isn't what it really looks like. As I said, the shadow has dominion over the empty and its residents. However, most of the time, this particular cosmic doesn't actually have to do anything to keep its subjects under control. See, normally, when something is sent to the empty, it's forced into a deep and eternal sleep, meaning that under normal circumstances, the dimension is completely silent and, well, empty. This piece allows the shadow itself to also get a good eternity's sleep, which is exactly what it wants. This thing does not like being up and active. All it ever wants to do is slumber within its silent void. Unfortunately, while not super common, it is possible that things within the realm will get woken up, and when that happens, the shadow will also be roused from its cosmic nap, leaving it just a bit cranky. Yeah, the shadow isn't a particularly pleasant primordial. It's quite manic and sadistic, and takes great pleasure in the suffering of others. Kinda seems to be one of the only things that brings it joy when it's forced into the waking world. It seems to get the absolute most enjoyment out of robbing people of their own happiness and experiences. Cass was able to make a bargain with the entity, in which it would stop pursuing his nephew Jack, but in return, the shadow would be allowed to drag Cass back to the empty forever. The creature accepted this offer, but with a very specific caveat. Instead of taking Cass right then and there, it would wait until he was at his happiest. Once the angel was on the cusp of experiencing his greatest moment of joy, the shadow would reach through the dimensional divide and yoink our boy back to the void. And it followed through. If you're unlucky enough to find yourself in this thing's crosshairs, good luck. The show gave us ways to murk Amara, Death, and even God himself, but we were never given a method for dispatching the shadow. Now, granted, we didn't see it in combat very much, but we did witness the thing kill the second Death Billy. Well, I guess technically we didn't necessarily see it, but we saw it effortlessly suck her into the goo, and since she was able to be replaced after the next Reaper reaping, it means that Billy did die after getting gooed. By far, its most impressive feat of durability was the time that the shadow survived a point-blank explosion of immense divine energy. Essentially, a supernova of primordial power kersploded right in this thing's face, and while it did pop its liquid form, the shadow was able to pull itself back together almost immediately. Keep in mind that this attack was supposed to be able to neutralize both God and the darkness, not necessarily by blowing them up, but by creating a magical singularity that could suck them in and keep them from ever escaping. And, the shadow was barely affected by this Godstopper spell. Honestly, it sorta seems like the shadow might be the single truly unkillable creature in the verse, as any time it's broken apart, it'll just reform from the empty. We don't know for sure if that's true, but it kinda seems like it. So yeah, best to just let it sleep. Now that we know a bit about the shadow itself, let's briefly discuss its home, the empty. Honestly, you can get a pretty good idea of what this place is just by its name. It's a pitch-black void of endless nothingness. Whenever we see the realm, it's depicted as an empty black space. Truly, there's no better way to describe it than a void. Although weirdly, it does kind of seem like this dimension has some degree of, substance to it. Just like how its ruler can appear as black goo, the empty itself is sometimes visualized as being made of black goo. And in fact, the first time that we saw it, the shadow referenced its inhabitants as soaking in nothingness. Speaking of inhabitants, who exactly ends up here, and why? Well, we know that all demons and angels, including archangels, end up in the empty after getting ganked, as do at least some Nephilim. Once locked in, the deceased are forced into a deep and endless sleep. Like many details of the empty, the exact snoozing conditions here are a bit unclear. Initially, the shadow claimed that its subjects sleep dreamlessly forever, but then later it claimed that most are actually tormented by thoughts and nightmares about their greatest regrets. Now, that could have just been something it told Cass in order to freak him out, but even if it's telling the truth, it could be that dreaming conditions vary person to person. After all, Cass apparently died, went to, and came back from the empty at least 4 times, and he never mentioned anything about reliving his regrets. And trust me, that dude had plenty to regret. Speaking of coming back from the empty, it's really tough. Even if something manages to wake up from their Eterna nap, they won't be able to just stroll out of the void. As stated earlier, the shadow claimed that it and it alone had the power and authority to release creatures from the empty. Though we eventually saw that wasn't 100% accurate. There is a spell that can open up an earth portal into the abyss and allow non-snoozers to return to the mortal plane, But we technically don't know for sure if this offers a full escape from the empty. The one and only time we saw this spell used was when Lucifer's former vessel Nick awoke the dead archangel through a heartfelt yet psychotic prayer, and then later opened the portal to let him loose. But before Lucy could jump back into Nick, he was telekinetically flung back into the void by his son Jack, though it's not clear if this put him back to sleep. If you don't have someone on the outside waiting and willing to pierce the divide, then your only other option is to ask the Almighty for some divine intervention. When we first met the Shadow, it proudly claimed that not even God had any power over its realm. Yet later we saw that the big man revived both Lilith and Lucifer from nothingness. Hell, even before that point, we'd seen Castiel reborn several times, with God later taking credit for these miracles. When confronted about this inconsistency, the Shadow claimed that this shouldn't be possible, and that's kind of all we got about the subject. We also see that capital D Death and the Reapers have some ability to access the empty, but we don't know if they're responsible for delivering the dead into the void, or if the sleepers just get automatically sucked in post-mortem. We also don't know what exactly gets sent there. Like, when it comes to other afterlives, it's the souls of the deceased that rest there, but as for the empty, well, angels don't really have souls, and demons kind of just are souls that have been mutated. So if you kill either of them, then what exactly remains sleeping forever in the empty? Who knows? We'll just add that to the pile of questions we don't really have answers to. Alright, enough background. Let's finally get into the actual question. What are the Shadow and the empty? Where did they come from? Are they really older than God? And if so, then how do we square that with the twins' official story? Well, like most of the big cosmic topics that I cover, there's no official answer, and our ability to come up with one based on sound evidence is limited by the lack of detail and sometimes nonsensical writing. Still, I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't have some ideas that have some backing, flimsy as it may be. So let's get into some potential theories. The first is pretty simple. Both the empty and the Shadow are just creations of God, and everything the Shadow says is a lie that it's been fed. The empty could be some kind of trash pile for God's rejected projects, and the Shadow a glorified security guard meant to keep anything from getting out. That explanation gives us an answer, but not a particularly satisfying one, right? I mean, maybe some of you are okay with saying God did it, but personally, I think that kind of answer really diminishes the intrigue of the Shadow. I mean, it's presented as this cosmic thing that seems to sit outside of God's power, which is really unique and interesting, at least in my opinion. The same kind of sentiment also goes for the empty. I find it much more compelling if the vast void of nothingness is truly separate from God's creation, whether it be a blank canvas of reality itself, or some sort of greater cosmic space outside of the purview of even the Almighty himself. Billy does state that the empty is vast enough to contain a God-killing explosion. Perhaps it's so vast that the entirety of the multiversal quantum construct that contains all of creation is but a teeny tiny speck in an incomprehensibly large, cosmically infinite void of existence. Hell, for all we know, there could be other little zones of creation out amongst the empty, little islands of being in an infinite sea of nothingness, all governed by other cosmic beings similar to God. Chuck and Amara are presented as the oldest and strongest beings in existence, and since God made pretty much everything else that we see in the show, we just kind of take their word when they say that they were the first anything and that nothing predates them. But what if they don't even fully understand the vastness of existence themselves? In this reading of things, the Shadow could simply be another greater inhabitant of reality who took up residence on the edge of Chuck's creation for one reason or another. What exactly that reason would be is probably up to the viewer's interpretation, but at least this could explain the existence of another cosmic entity. Now, this does raise the question of how the twins could still believe themselves to be the be-all end-all, despite the presence of another random cosmic creature that neither of them cooked up, but that's not really that hard to explain. After all, we don't even know if Amara knows about the Shadow, and even if she did, she would just assume it's another one of her brother's projects. As for God, well, the dude is a known liar and megalomaniac. If anyone were to ask him about the Shadow, he probably just wouldn't tell them the truth. Simple as that. This explanation can also iron out some of the inconsistencies around who does and doesn't have power over the empty by saying that the Shadow just doesn't really know what it's talking about. It claimed this section of nothingness for itself, but in reality, the empty isn't really a place that anyone in particular has or doesn't have innate authority over. It's just about who has the juice to make their will a reality. It's a cool theory. one that really expands the scope of the supernatural universe, and one that's kind of hard to fully disprove. After all, any lore that contradicts it can just be chalked up to something that the God twins either didn't know or actively lied about. At the same time, there's not really a lot of evidence to actively support the idea that there's a whole wider cosmic ecosystem of creatures completely unrelated to God. So ultimately, whether or not you buy into this theory comes down to how comfortable you are using cool headcanon to override established lore. While we're on the subject of overriding the lore, let's talk about a theory that, based on my comments section, is surprisingly common. At the end of Season 14, we learned that God, aka Chuck Shirley, is a bit of a dick. I mean, we already kind of knew that, but once he tries to get Dean to kill Jack before opening up a hell rift, that dickishness reached new heights. Heights that some fans felt didn't necessarily fit the supposed almighty. While waiting for Season 15, some of those fans began to wonder, what if Chuck wasn't actually God? What if he was just some poser who was somehow able to convincingly impersonate the true Lord? Even after Season 15 came out and strongly reaffirmed the narrative that Chuck was definitely supposed to be God, the imposter theory stuck around. Now, obviously, if you want to believe this theory, then you've got to be able to answer one very important question. If Chuck isn't God, then who is, and what happened to him? Luckily, for those who don't want to believe that Chuck is the big man, there is another cosmic being of uncertain origin. Yes, some fans truly believe that the Shadow, the gloopy, sleepy psychopath, is actually the one true God and creator of the multiverse. There are a few different explanations as to how this could be possible, but honestly, a lot of them kind of rely more on one's personal interpretation of gods and metaphysics rather than in-universe evidence. However, there is one version of the theory that I think is kind of interesting. The idea is that Chuck, whatever the hell he actually is, was somehow able to extract and absorb the real God's divine power, essentially doing to the Lord what Jack would later do to Chuck himself. This gave the phony all of God's power, knowledge, and memories, and allowed him to cloak himself in the identity so thoroughly that even the Lord's twin sister couldn't see through the deception. After having his divinity extracted, Elohim was left as a shadow of his former self, allowing Chuck to scramble his mind so that he would hopefully never ever remember the truth about who he is and what happened to him. This explains why the Shadow believes contradictory or just outright false information. Its brain has either been washed or fully broken in order to preserve the usurper's secret. As for the Empty, well, there was always a chance that the OGG would recover, so better stash him somewhere that no one will ever find him. In this scenario, the Void could have already existed for some reason, or Chuck could have whipped it up specifically to imprison his predecessor. It's not a perfect theory, and personally, I don't really subscribe to it, but it's still interesting to think about. For me, the best part of this theory is that when Billy recruits Jack and the Shadow to help take down Chuck, you end up with a team composed of the person who wants to be the new God, the one who actually becomes the new God, and the original God, whom Chuck replaced, all uniting against the imposter. You know, most of these theories really hinge on the idea that our shady friend exists on the same level of being as the so-called Primordials, namely Chuck, Amara, Death, and sometimes the other Horsemen. That was never really confirmed, but it just feels right, since they're not only immensely powerful, but also timeless in a way that not even the Archangels can match. Thing is, if you look at the other alleged cosmics or primordials or whatever, you should pick up on another commonality between them. God, the darkness, and the Horsemen may or may not be part of creation in the same way as, well, basically everything else, but they're also not these random, powerful, eldritch things that are just completely detached from reality as we know it. No, instead they each serve as the embodiment or personification of some sort of fundamental concept or force. God embodies light in creation. He represents a reality filled with a potentially infinite number of unique individual things. Amara is the opposite. She's literally called the Darkness, and is constantly referred to as a being of primordial destruction. Though, if you actually listen to her, it's clear she's actually really all about unity. When it comes to Death and his bros, well, I mean, they're just straight up named after their particular personifications. Essentially, within the world of supernatural, primordial beings, at least the ones that we know of, aren't random outer gods. They're complex sentient beings who act as walking, talking embodiments of core aspects of reality itself. So, if that's the case, and we accept the idea that the Shadow is in fact a genuine colleague of the confirmed cosmics, then it stands to reason that it too would be a sentient encapsulation of some base component of reality, right? So then, what part of existence could this obsidian oddity represent? Well, let's go back to the empty for a sec. The shadow itself describes this place as nothing. It's a realm where one is engulfed in nothingness, represented by the same black goo that makes up the shadow's default form. And while soaking in this nothingness, you are seen as the creature's property. With all that in mind, I think it would be safe to infer that the shadow's true place in the grand cosmic order is as an embodiment of nothingness. It is emptiness incarnate, non-existent given a sentient form, a living, breathing manifestation of null. Now, some of you are probably saying, isn't that Amara's whole deal? Which makes sense. I mean, if God represents light and being and everything, then shouldn't his counterpart, who again is literally named darkness, represent nothing? In fact, Chuck himself describes the relationship this way. So, case closed, right? Well, the thing you have to remember about Chuck is that not only is he a liar, he also struggles to truly understand his twin. I get into this more into my video about God in the Darkness, but if you actually listen to what Amara says throughout the show, then it becomes clear that she doesn't actually hate other things for existing. She just prefers a world where everything is equal and unified. In this way, their dynamic isn't really that God is everything and Amara is nothing, but rather two different ways in which the concept of everything can take shape, either filled with an infinite number of separate unique things, or occupied by a small number of equal unified things. By contrast, this theory, which I personally prefer, states that the shadow represents true nothingness, a level of non-being that I don't even think I can properly describe. It's not the color black or darkness or even empty space in the way that we comprehend, but rather non-existence so thorough that even reality isn't there. Remember how the shadow told Cass that he, an angel, would go mad if he so much as glimpsed its true form uncloaked by the goo? Well, I don't think that's because it looks like an infinitely complex Lovecraftian being. Instead, it's kind of the opposite. Anyone who looks upon this thing will see a void so fundamentally empty that even celestial beings can't fully wrap their heads around it. It's kind of like those negative sound rooms where it gets so quiet that people start feeling sick because we just aren't built for that level of silence. Now, some of you are probably thinking that this doesn't really make sense. I mean, being made of nothingness, non-existence incarnate, aren't those oxymorons? And yeah, they kind of are, at least when operating on the human level of reality. I actually think that this could be used to explain why the shadow is so unhinged. Its very being is a contradiction. If you've ever heard the expression, existence is pain, I kind of think that the shadow feels that in a very literal sense. Actually, I'll go even further than that. I genuinely believe that the most cursed part of this creature's contradictory existence is that it is the only being in all of Supernatural that cannot be perma-killed. You can kill God and the darkness and even death itself, but you can't really kill nothing. And this is why the thing desperately wants to sleep forever, because nap time is the closest it can ever get to being free of its nonsensical existence. Personally, I find this to be the most interesting explanation for what the shadow actually is, and I think it does a good job of giving this bizarre entity a place within Supernatural's larger mythos. That's great and all, but it doesn't really explain where this thing came from, or whether it truly does predate the God Twins. Well, to answer that, let's briefly talk about Taoist philosophy in a super simplified way. The twins and their relationship are sometimes compared to yin and yang, since they're two distinct yet equal forces that perfectly balance each other, at least in theory. Well, in Taoist tradition, there's another concept known as wuji, in which there is no yin or yang. Instead, they and everything they represent exist together, indistinct from each other, in a state where there is no duality or contrast. Again, we're really super oversimplifying. But it's like the pre-Big Bang. Everything that ever would or could come into being all crammed together as a singular yet infinite unmanifested potential. Relating this back to Supernatural, if God and the darkness are the cosmic yin and yang, then their pre-split unified form would be seen as a representation of wuji. But what does that have to do with the shadow? Well, the thing about wuji is that it actually has two different interpretations. On the one hand, it's everything, infinity, the sum total of all possibilities, perfectly united in a neutral, undifferentiated state. At the same time, if all of reality is perfectly uniform with absolutely no distinctions on any level whatsoever, well, then you also kind of have nothing, right? Like, there are quite literally no things, meaning that you can't even really tell the difference between something and nothing, since, on a conceptual level at least, They're two different things. This is the other side of Wuji. It can represent pre-existence as everything, but it can also represent nothingness and a state of total emptiness. Wuji can represent either of these extremes, or it can be both at the same time, because at a certain point, they kind of become indistinguishable from each other, kind of like the old glass half empty versus half full debate. Personally, I think that this could be seen as a way of viewing the state of reality prior to the twins' separation. You had everything and nothing at the same time, a kind of superpositional Schrodinger's existence. In my opinion, when Amara describes existing as a singular eternal being, it's because she remembers what you might call the positive Wuji, which represents the pre-existence as everything unified and unmanifested. And when the shadow claims that there was nothing before the twins, it's because it remembers, or at least believes in, the quote-unquote negative Wuji, in which there truly was nothing. Both are equally true, since they're just different interpretations of the same concept. Then, when the twins split, which I discuss more in their dedicated video, the superposition collapsed, since there was now two distinct things, and as a result, there was also now a clear distinction between them and not them, aka nothingness. As for why that nothingness embodied as a sentient being, well, it's probably for the same reason that the twins did, which just kind of amounts to, it's just how things shook out. So that's my favorite interpretation of the shadow. But what about its realm? I actually think that the empty is a little bit easier to explain. It's just the empty portion of reality that lies outside of God's creation. It's kind of hard to conceptualize all of existence in terms of, like, space. But at one point, Billy describes the entirety of creation as a multiversal quantum construct. And while she doesn't really explain what that is or how it works, the wording does kind of imply that there are some sort of larger spatial parameters to God's domain. Whether you want to imagine it as a bubble floating through the empty, or maybe creation and non-existence as opposite poles of existence, with the empty as a buffer between them, the point is that I think that the void is just the abstract space that lies outside of God's multiverse. Also, yes, I definitely think that there's only one empty, and angels and demons from every universe go there. As for why they go there, well, my headcanon is that it all comes down to them not having a place within the greater order of the universe. Chuck set up a whole system for human death. They live on as souls and have a number of alternate dimensions that they can be shuttled to for long-term storage. Demons and angels also live on after death, or second death. However, for one reason or another, the big man just didn't give them anywhere to go after getting got. So, they just kind of fall through the cracks and get spat out into the void where, free from the protection of their creator, they fall under the influence of the shadow, as it sedates them for all of eternity. Now, you might think that this would annoy the shadow. I mean, if it's all about nothingness and emptiness, then it probably wouldn't want stuff cluttering up its turf. Well, I actually think that it gets a kick out of quote-unquote taking God's things, and sees every little speck of creation that it seizes and silences as another little one-up it gets on the creator. If you believe all that, then there's just one last burning question I want to touch on before we wrap up. Why did the shadow think that God couldn't pull things back from the empty? I mean, if a newborn Nephilim and a messed up mere mortal can jailbreak the place, then why couldn't the Lord? The obvious answer is that it was just lies and ignorance. But just for funsies, let's assume that Shad was telling the truth, and Chuck really isn't supposed to have any pull in the empty. Like, maybe outside of his construct, his power isn't quite as absolute, and the shadow is able to use its vague cosmic powers to specifically block Chuck from retrieving the lost souls. Would there still be a way to make sense of the times when we just straight up see him break his hypothetical rule? Maybe. Out of all the characters that should have ended up in the empty, only 3 get revived by God: Castiel, Lilith, and Lucifer. And of them, only Lilith's situation is relatively straightforward. Of all the times that Cass was killed and brought back, only the ones in seasons 12 and 15 are confirmed to have sent him to the empty, and we know that Chuck wasn't involved in undoing either of those. Chuck is credited for fixing at least Cass's first 2 fatalities, and actually, when our boy is slain for the very first time, he was quite literally standing right next to God in the flesh. I would totally believe that the Lord just kept Cass's spirit from falling into the empty in the first place. We don't technically know if he can do that, but come on, he definitely can. And there was no better time to do so. The same thing could have happened during his second death in Season 5. We know God was watching the apocalyptic showdown go down, so maybe he intervened as soon as Cass got popped. It's also worth noting that we don't even really know if Cass was still an angel at that point. Throughout Season 5, he gradually runs out of angelic power, and by the time of his second curse exploding, he seemed mostly, if not entirely, human. This matters because we later see Cass actually legitimately die while human, and this was reversed by a regular-ass angel named Gadriel, just as easily as it would have been if Cass had been human all along. That just leaves the Season 7 death at the hands of the Leviathans, and I'll be honest, I don't necessarily buy that he even died here. The Chompers claim that he did, then they proceed to violently explode out of his Jimmy suit, but I don't know. I just think there's room to argue that maybe our boy held on in there, and Chuck just had to stitch his vessel back together. So, Cass's resurrections have a bit of sussiness to him. But what about Lucifer? Well, his situation is actually pretty interesting. We pretty much know for a fact that Lucy was in the empty when he was risen, having been awakened and nearly smuggled back to Earth by Nick. Jack stops the jailbreak early and flings his father back into the void, but as I said earlier, we don't actually know if this also put him back to sleep. I'm guessing that it didn't, and since the Shadow doesn't seem capable of resedating anyone who it didn't personally wake up, then I'm left to assume that Lucy was still wide awake out there. Now, he wasn't seen with or mentioned by any of the Billy Jack Shadow tag team, but I'm willing to bet that the Shadow just stuffed him deep down into the realm just as it threatened to do with Cass. But, like Cass said, this still wouldn't put him to sleep. This makes me wonder, if Lucifer was already awake, then couldn't Chuck have just opened another portal and pulled his son out that way? Or if that ritual wouldn't work for him for some reason, then maybe he could just reopen the one that Nick made? I don't know, I just think it's interesting that of the few folks who God grabbed, 2 of them had some really unusual circumstances going on. And then there's Lilith, who, well, I'll be honest, she had a pretty much straightforward death and resurrection. She even says that she was in the empty before Chuck brought her back, so yeah, I guess the guy really could just recall any of his children from the empty anytime he wanted. So what exactly are the empty and its Shadow? Who knows? Hell, I don't even think the writers had a concrete or consistent idea of where these things fit into the show's larger cosmology. Kind of annoying, but honestly, that's also kind of the fun of Supernatural. There's a lot of lore, but also some blanks that you can fill in with your own headcanon. As laid out in this video, there's plenty of theories to fully flesh out this freaky figure and its domain. You just gotta pick the one that you like best. But what do you guys think? What's your opinion on the Shadow and its realm? Let me know in the comments. I'll have more content for you soon, but for now, carry on.